All right, folks. Thanks again for joining us today for the Applying the New Classification Structure and the SES Award webinar today. I'm Colin Entwistle, Deputy Head of Employment for NDS, alongside of my colleague here in Paul Musso. We do have a fair bit to get through today, and we'll get started now. So I might just start with an acknowledgement to country. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and to those emerging. Today I'll join you from Wadawurrung country in a little area called Ocean Grove outside of Geelong in Victoria. So welcome, folks. Great to have you all attend. Great to see such a volume of attendees. Like I said, I think we've probably broken a record for an NDS webinar today. So it's obviously front and centre in everyone's mind. A bit of housekeeping, as I've said, if you can keep your microphones on mute, it'll get a bit chaotic. If not, I'll leave it to you whether you wish to have your screen on or not. I encourage you to put comments and questions into the chat room. Again, very mindful it's a big group, so we'll circle back to questions when we can. I'm mindful a big dump of questions. Paul will capture these and we'll take these offline at the end of the session as well. Paul might circle back and capture a few key themes depending on time towards the end of today's meeting. Just another element to the Q&A approach, NDS will be looking to load a bit of a frequently asked questions or Q&A page on the website where we'll capture some of these questions and formalise some of those responses so you can reference those alongside of the wage guide documentation as well. Hopefully many of you have had a chance to have a bit of a look. I will welcome Kyle Scott from Australian Business Lawyers, who's been part of our working group and have put together some of these guidance documents, and he will do a bit of a run through with you today. Just a reminder that it is a guidance document. It's not meant to be more than what it is. You'll all have come from different landscapes and different circumstances, but we do hope and that it does provide some really good concept of how to go about the, I guess, the classification grading process as you begin. I think I'll stop there and hand over to you, Kyle. I'll pop up the document on the screen and you can kick off with a bit of a run through. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Colin. Afternoon or morning for perhaps some of you on the West Coast, but otherwise afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you. Thanks for tuning in. So what we will do is effectively do a little bit of a page turn of the guidance document. I think that's probably the best way to take you through the material. I understand that it's been distributed quite recently. I imagine some of you might have copies. Some of you might not have looked at it. I'm not expecting that people have read it in full. And so I think if you bear with us, I think we'll just effectively work through it. I'll give you my kind of running commentary, and then we can open it up to Q&A. So I'll try not to talk for too long, because obviously you guys will need to go away, read it at your own time. But hopefully, as Colin said, it's a useful guide. Now, Colin's going to, I think, drive the document. So I'll let you know, Colin, as we work through. But maybe if we just start at the contents page, and I'll give you guys, I'll show you a little bit just in terms of how the guide is structured. So you can see there, I think the first 12 sections are effectively the content in terms of the guide. So that's the guidance note. And then we've got 4 attachments at the end of the guidance note. So we'll work through it, but just in terms of the structure, attachment A is a complete copy of the new classification structure that will go into the award effective 30 June. Attachment B is then a glossary of key terms. And as we'll work through it, you'll see, and you might have already seen with the gateway requirements or the classification structure more broadly, there's a bunch of terms in there. Very few of them are defined in the award. So it's helpful to kind of have an objective whether it be a dictionary definition or what we say is the correct meaning for these phrases. So hopefully that's a useful attachment to the document. I think attachments C and D will then be the really helpful documents for each of you when you actually apply the grading process and actually undertake what you need to do. So attachment C is a step-by-step guide. And so we'll have a look at that. And then attachment D is effectively a template form that you might choose to use when you actually grade each employee. And so, as Colin said, it's a guide. It's a good practice guide. Now, we've been quite deliberate with that. This guide's not talking about bare legal minimum requirements, but equally it's not talking about absolute best practice. So we've tried to have a fairly sensible middle ground where obviously the modern award and the requirement to grade employees that it's a legal obligation. The modern award is a legal instrument. So it's important that we look at what the requirements are. We have gone beyond the mere requirements and we've made some suggestions throughout as to practical things that you might choose to do, but we're not pretending that it's the absolute best practice as well. So just bear that in mind in terms of where it's pitched. As an organisation, you might choose to do additional things, and that is obviously fine and encouraged. But it is coming from that kind of context of we're dealing with new legislative award changes. So we're looking at what the requirements are rather than what we say everyone should do as a model employer. So what we'll do is I'll basically try and work through the body of the guidance note. You can see that the content's about 16 pages. Then with the attachments, we're looking at 28, 29 pages. So it's a fairly decent sized document. I'm not going to sit here and read the document to you. I don't think anyone wants me to do that. I don't particularly want to do that this afternoon. So I will simply kind of give you my running commentary as we work through it. So unless there's anything else, Colin, we'll do that. I have no doubt that the vast majority of people on the webinar today have been around for at least the last few years and have heard ad nauseum NDS or ABLA or others talk about the award review and the Fair Work Commission process. It's been a decade in the making, and I'm not going to kind of rehash old grounds. That's not the purpose of today's session. But what I'll say is the Fair Work Commission series of decisions, I think the last one was December, just before Christmas, December last year. The matter has now effectively concluded. They've issued a determination, and the determination sets out the changes that will come into effect into the award from 30 June. There are some changes that go beyond simply the wages and the classification structure. For example, there's, I think, a tweak to the higher duties clause, for example. So there are some changes to the award, but the overwhelming, focus of the proceedings and the changes relate to the wages structure. And so we're going to obviously focus on that. At a high level, the new wage methodology, so the wage setting methodology in the award, has two components. The first is that we need to grade each employee who's covered by the award into a particular classification or level. That's not too different to what any employer has to do for any award covered employee in any industry. You've got to work out whether the person's a level 3 or a level 6, and that then sets their minimum wages. So the first task, and that's the focus of today's session, is we effectively need to grade or classify the employees. The second element then is for supported employees, that grading process is then overlaid with what I call a modified SWS assessment, which looks at the productivity or the output of the employee, ends up with a percentage figure, and the employee is then entitled to the percentage of the relevant minimum wage. Now, there's complex transitional arrangements, and we can talk about that if we need to, but we aren't sitting here talking about the SWS assessment process. That no doubt is an important issue, and that'll be the topic for future discussion. today's session is all about that first component, which is we need to grade employees. So, and the practice guide, the document is about that, the grading process. So currently, as of today, the award has a bunch of approved wage assessment tools. They will be removed from the award effective 30 June. So just bear that in mind. We might move to the next page, Colin. We've got a little blurb there about the purpose of the guidance note. We've got an appropriate disclaimer on it about the fact that it doesn't constitute legal advice. And if you wish to, you should obtain your own independent legal advice. It's a guidance note to provide some practical help for you in grading employees. Obviously, probably the most important point to take away is that you need to classify or grade employees by no later than 30 June. That is the deadline. So we're effectively working on 3 months from today. Bear in mind that we're not simply talking about supported employees. The way the award will be drafted will say an employee will be graded by the employer in one of the grades in Schedule A of the award. So you will have non-supported employees at the moment who might be covered by the Supported Employment Award, who might sit at grade 3, 4, 5, 6. The classification structure will change on 30 June. And so my view at least is you should undertake this grading process for both your supported employee cohort and your non-supported employees, because there's a prospect, and I think it's unlikely, but there's a possibility that you might reassess whether or not a supervisor is grade 5 or 4 or whatever it might be. And you're going to be looking at a new classification structure. So it's not limited to supported employees. We call out there about halfway down the page that the main changes to the classification structure, there's 2 main changes. The first is that we will, of course, have these 2 new grades. So grades A and grade B will be slotted into the existing classification structure of levels or grades 1 to 7. A and B will sit above grade 1. So the sequence will be A, B, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's obviously a significant change. There's 2 new grades. The second change is that the classification definitions or descriptors, so i.e. the body of the classification structure, the words of the classification structure have changed. And we'll have a look at that. I'll just quote the third last paragraph here, and this will be in the award obligation. You need to classify into each employee into one of the grades, having regard to the employee's skills, experience, and qualifications, and the nature of the position in which the employee is employed. So that's the test, or that's the task that we need to do. If we move on, Colin, please. I've got at point 5, the first part of point 5, we kind of have some general principles around award interpretation. And we're not necessarily wanting to get into the legal case law around how we deal with this, but I think it's just helpful context. There are some principles about award interpretation that have been developed over the years. What we're really looking to do is, when we're interpreting an award and the words within it, we're looking to discern the objective meaning of the words, having regard to context and purpose. So what that means is we don't blindly take a dictionary definition and adopt that as gospel, but that is a very helpful starting point. So the starting point is, if a word in a modern award is not defined by the award, and clause 2 sets out the definitions, and of course, if a word is defined, we use the definition provided in the award, but the vast majority of these phrases and words are not defined. So the starting point is we look at the ordinary general meaning of the word, but then we have to apply it having regard to context and purpose. So if a word's used in a particular purpose, that might mean that we move away from the strict dictionary definition. There's a bunch of phrases, things like sequential steps, constant monitoring, direct supervision, basic tasks, simple tasks. There's all these phrases. And what I'll say is they're not defined. Quite often it might be a fine distinction as to how you apply or interpret or define these phrases. What we've done is started with the ordinary meaning of the word, and we've got a glossary that effectively sets out what we say the words mean. But my view about award classification structures in every modern award is that there's an element of art versus science to it. Then it's quite often not a straightforward task to try and work out whether someone's doing a simple task or whether it's not simple. You obviously have to do your best and try and get it right. But I'm just, I guess the caveat there is it's not necessarily always easy, and that's not an issue or a problem that's confined to the supported employment sector. I see disputes all the time about how someone's been graded in different industries under the award, and it can quite often be, you look at the classification structure in totality, and sometimes it's a best fit kind of judgment call that you have to make. And so what we say is you are making an objective evaluative judgment. So bear that in mind. Now, we say that there's two key elements which are fundamental to properly navigating the structure. And so when you look at the classification structure, two pretty well entrenched principles of all classification structure is you're looking at how complex is the work that they're doing, so task complexity. And then you're also looking at levels of supervision versus autonomy. So they tend to be the two things that you see will change as you progress through the classification structure. You can see in terms of task complexity, it starts with simple tasks at A and B, basic tasks at grade 2, and more complex tasks at 3. And then from grade 4 and above, we start to have trade certifications and things like that. Now, a very good question to ask me would be, what is the difference between a simple task and a basic task? I don't know. If you look at the dictionary definitions of those two words, they virtually mean the same thing. They are synonyms of each other. So that's why I said earlier, sometimes it's a little bit of best judgment. So I don't know why they've drawn this distinction between simple tasks and basic, but I guess the saving grace is the phrase simple task is confined to grade A and B, and there are some gateway requirements there. So the issue doesn't necessarily, it's not a fatal issue when you work through it. We'll move over to the next page, Colin. Thank you. And so that second element is supervision levels that I spoke about. And you can see there, we get this progressive movement from having direct supervision, then to routine supervision, through to general supervision. And then presumably as we get higher, you've got people who are working without supervision. I won't take you through the text there. What we've tried to do is give you our best view as to what these phrases mean in a practical sense. But, and we're obviously having regard to ordinary meaning of words and things like that. But just bear in mind, like minds can differ in terms of drawing distinctions with these things. All right, so we might move then into the body of the classification structure. At part 6, we're going to look at the new grades A and B. Now, I think that over the page, what I'll say is for grades A and B, they're a little bit funny in the sense that they have these gateway requirements. And so they're effectively threshold or prerequisites to getting into grade A and B. If the employee satisfies or if those gateway requirements are established, then the person can obviously be graded or classified into A or B. If the person doesn't meet, and I think there's 5 elements of the gateway requirements, if they don't meet those, then the person cannot be graded into A and B, and instead must be graded into 1 through 7. Now, these gateway requirements have a kind of somewhat of a history in the sense that there was an ARTD trial around, I think it was delayed because of COVID, but it was around 2021 where there was this trial. There was a trial report. Some of you might have participated in that field trial. The trial report said, well, there was some confusion about these gateway requirements, which from my perspective is hardly surprising when we're looking at something for the first time. So what part 6 of the document contains is effectively extracts from the Fair Work Commission decisions when they set out their reasoning for creating grades A and B. So I think it's helpful to read that to start to get a feel for what the Commission was trying to do in creating grades A and B. And it talks about, in essence, the paradigm of supported employment being very different to to open employment, where these roles, it's not a case where the employer says, I have a vacancy, I have a job over here that I need someone to fill, and I'll put an ad in the, I was going to say ad in the paper, that's a bit outdated. Recruit for that role, and we would hire someone who meets those needs. Now, certainly my understanding of social enterprises and supported employment is sometimes often it's the reverse. The employee is wanting to get some employment experience and develop some skills, comes into a particular organisation. You have a look at what the person's capacities, capability, limitations, restrictions might be, and then you effectively create or customise some duties for that person to do that they're capable of doing. And so the Fair Work Commission is saying, well, look, that's not how labour is typically sourced in open employment. It's a different paradigm, and so we need to recognise that in the value of the work and the minimum wages that we set. So I would encourage you to have a read of that part before you move to the gateway requirements, because it does help you to try and draw that distinction sometimes. We then move to the next part, please, Colin. So we're now at the specific gateway requirements. You can see what I've got there in part 7 is effectively a cut and paste of what will be in the award. So the award will say grades A and B apply to an employee with a disability who, because of their disability, does not have the capacity to undertake the duties or exercise the level of skill and responsibility of any position to which grades 1 to 7 apply. And then secondly, they have to be placed in a position by the employer which consists of duties and supervision that accommodate the effects of their disability. And secondly, obviously that position can't fall into grade 1 to 7. And the Commission's trying to make it clear that they're calling that out, that even if the other requirements are met, if the role is a grade 1 to 7 role, then you need to grade them into 1 to 7. So we're getting to the meaty bit now. Part 8 of the document is saying, okay, well, how do we actually work through those gateway requirements? There are 5 elements to it. Some of them should be straightforward and uncontroversial, and others might be tricky. So the first element is the employee must have a disability. The phrase employee with a disability is defined in the award. It's defined referable to the relevant legislation. You guys will likely know that legislation or the relevant definition far better than I would, but that should be pretty straightforward. What that means, of course, is if you have an employee without a disability, then they cannot fall within grade A or B. The second element then is that the employee must not have the capacity to undertake the duties or exercise the level of skill and responsibility of any position to which grade 1 to 7 applies. So we're looking at their capacity, not in a legal sense or a medical sense, we're looking at their capability to perform work. What's interesting here, and I'll just make this observation quickly, most classification structures and modern awards are referable to the work that someone does. So if I employ a surgeon who's a qualified surgeon, but he's having a career break or she's having a career break and is happy to clean windows for my window cleaning company, the fact that they're a surgeon doesn't mean that I have to pay them squillions of dollars. classifications and modern awards are looking at the work they actually perform. But interestingly, for people like myself, this second element is talking about looking at their capacity or capability. So that introduces this notion of saying, okay, well, if I'm giving them quite basic duties, but they're actually capable of doing more, I need to consider their capability here, hypothetical capability, not what they're actually doing. So if someone can do grade 1 to 7 work, they must be classified into grade 1 to 7. If we move to the next page, the third element then, and sorry, I'll make this observation as well. This will be a really key point. If someone can do one or two things, one or two duties that fall within grade 2, but they can't do a bunch of other stuff that falls within grade 2, then they do not have the capability or capacity to perform a position in grade 2. So you will have scenarios where one person can do part of grade 2 work, but not all of it. The intention behind this is, and I think it's somewhere else in the guidance notes, I'll try and paraphrase it, I'll probably misquote, but it must be expected that the employer could reasonably expect that person to do anything that falls within grade 2. And if the person's not able to do everything or anything within grade 2, they can only do one or two things, then the intention is that they would meet this part of the gateway requirement and be within A and B. Third element, this should be a straightforward one. If they don't have the capability to do grade 1 to 7 work, this element says, well, their lack of capacity must be due to or because of their disability. So if their lack of capacity or capability is not due to their disability, it's for some other reason, well, then this requirement won't be met. We can then move to the fourth requirement. So this introduces, and this is why the rationale in the decisions from the Fair Work Commission are important. They have to be effectively placed in a position which consists of duties and supervision and monitoring which accommodate the effects of their disability. So it's contemplating not putting someone into what I call an off-the-shelf job and expecting them to do it. It's intended or it's contemplated that there's a level of tailoring or customization to meet their requirements. Now, we're not talking here about reasonable adjustments within the language of disability discrimination legislation. We're talking about actually changing how the work is done or how, what part of the work they do, et cetera, et cetera. So an example might be you have a packing operation and a particular employee might be able to do one part of the production line, but can't do any other part. And both, we're talking about the duties there and also the supervision. So if someone doesn't require any extra supervision or monitoring that an employee without a disability would be expected to work under, then that requirement might not be met. So that's the fourth requirement. And then we'll move to the last one. And this is a bit of a catch-all in my view. They've just chucked it in because I think it's caught in one of the other ones. They reinforce the fact that the position can't fall into grades 1 to 7. And the second paragraph under that bullet point is what I was searching for earlier. The Fair Work Commission clarified that the mere performance of one of the indicative tasks listed in grades 1 to 7, in circumstances where the employee's job has been established or tailored to align with their level of capacity, is not sufficient or intended to result in them falling into grade 1 to 7. And so again, that's a quote from the Fair Work Commission decision. The award will also contain the following clause in it. So this is helpful as well. The award will say an employee in any of the grades 1 to 7 may, subject to any necessary training, be required to perform any or all the duties in the classification descriptors. Now, I would encourage a fairly sensible approach to that. I don't think it would be necessarily the correct application of the classification structure if you had someone who could do 95% of grade 2 work but there was one reference in grade 2 to a particular task or duty, and they can't do that, I think you would err on the side of, okay, well, they can effectively do grade 2 work, rather than taking the approach of, oh, sorry, there's one tiny thing that you can't do, and so therefore you can't be in grade 2. I think a fairly pragmatic, sensible application should be the way to go. I think we call most of that out in the rest of that page. So in a nutshell, they're the 5 gateway requirements. If those 5 gateway requirements are established, you should be grading the employee into grade A and B, which we'll come to. Now you need all 5 of the gateway requirements to be established. It's not just one or the other, or it's not one of the 5, it's all 5. So if someone meets 4 of them but doesn't meet the 5th one, then they must go into 1 to 7. So I'll move on now that we've gone through.
I'll give you a pause opportunity too, Kyle. Just I'm conscious of you running out of steam and talking. So I'll give you a pause so you can take a drink. I noticed there was a bit of a spike in the chat box, which I don't quite have vision on. Paul, is there anything that you wanted to point to in the chats that'd be worth just pausing on for now to talk to at all?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. There's been some questions around DSP eligibility. Now, really, this is quite clear. The employee either has to be receiving DSP or eligible for DSP before they can be classified into grade A or B. If they're not receiving DSP or they're not eligible for it, they cannot be classified in grade A or B. And I've included some material in there about definitions and whatnot. Even if they're testing their eligibility for DSP, they cannot be classified into grade A or B.
Cool. And again, just a reinforcement, guys, that we'll capture some of these key themes and questions and pop them up on our frequently answered question page on the website. So for those that jumped in a little bit late and didn't catch that. Thanks, Paul. Hopefully that also gave you a bit of a time for a breather there, Kyle. I'll mute myself again and let you keep going.
No worries. Thanks, Colin. So we've gone through the gateway requirements. Let's assume our employee meets each of those gateway requirements. We then are looking at grade A and B. Now, grade A, we'll tease out the fact that classification structures are imperfect. So you just have to accept that you live in this imperfect world. You will have people who can do bits of A and bits of B. You might have a scenario where part of the grade A criteria is relevant and applicable, but but not all of it. And so it is this objective best fit evaluative judgment that you may need to make. So we're in grade A and B. Let's have a look at what they're talking about. So they talk about simple tasks. I want to try and find, so I think where the cursor is, we talk about simple tasks and direct supervision. So both grade A and B refer to simple tasks, and they both refer to direct supervision, so that they're not different in that respect. So if suddenly we get through the gateway requirements and we look at A and B, and they talk about simple tasks, and you say, oh, hang on, this particular employee doesn't do simple tasks, they do quite complex tasks, well, then I think you move to 1 to 7. Even though the gateway requirements apply, you get to grade A and B and they're not relevant for that person, so you need to move up to 1 to 7. Equally, both grade A and B talk about working under direct supervision. So you can get to a scenario where you go, okay, the person, we're through the gateway requirements, the person does do simple tasks, but they don't work under direct supervision. They work unsupervised. Now, it's probably unlikely, but if that occurs, then I think, again, you move up to 1 to 7. They are the two constants between grade A and B. So they don't necessarily distinguish between A and B. If we then have a look at the 3 dot points are where grade A and B depart. So these are the distinguishing features. So both A and B talk about simple tasks, but one talks about those simple tasks consisting of up to 3 sequential steps or subtasks, versus B that talks about, okay, it's still a simple task, but it involves more than 3 sequential steps or subtasks. So that's the first distinguishing feature. The second is there's references to using tools with basic functionality in grade A. And then in grade B, there's references to using mechanical or electric equipment or tools. So that's the second part where they diverge. And then the third is grade A talks about working with constant monitoring, and grade B talks about regular monitoring. So they're the 3 points that we're going to have to look at to say, well, I'm through the gateway requirements for this particular employee. I now need to toss up and select A or B. These are the 3 things that we need to use to try and work out where the employee fits. Now, because it talks about simple tasks, we now need to work out how many sequential steps or subtasks are involved in a particular task. Now, employees might perform one task and one task only. They might perform 10 different tasks. Obviously, we need to identify the tasks that they perform. So for a particular employee, we'd have to say, okay, this person generally does 3 or 4 tasks. So let's look at each of those tasks. And for each of those tasks, we need to try and work out how many sequential steps or subtasks each of those tasks make up. Even the phrases sequential steps and subtasks, it's all a little bit of a nightmare in trying to understand what we're talking about. If we jump over to the next page, I think we've got some more information here. So I want to try and give you an example. There's an example there in the second part of the second paragraph. The task of assembling a particular product might involve a range of subtasks. So we have someone who's doing an assembly task. That's the task. What are the subtasks? Well, the person folds a flat pack into a cardboard box. They then put some components into the box. They then seal the box, they weigh the box, and they place a sticker on the box. So that might be an example of how a particular task has 5 or 6 different subtasks. So you'll have to look at that. And my view, at least, is grade A is looking at employees doing very simple tasks that don't have any real degree of complexity, or it's not an overly involved thing that they're doing. So my suspicion is that a lot of people who go through the gateway requirements, more than half might end up in B. Don't quote me on that, but I think grade A is, once you start looking at the sequential steps, I don't know that there's that many tasks that would only involve 1 or 2 sequential steps. Obviously, there's going to be some difference of opinion from time to time in terms of how do we count or characterize the subtasks or the sequential steps. We've given you some examples, but sometimes the more examples we give, the more complex it becomes and the more confused everyone is. So just bear in mind that you'll need to work through that. It's not intended to be a super technical, granular exercise. Like, we're not talking about, okay, the person folds a box. So the subtasks with folding a box are bending over and picking it up. That's one subtask. Folding at one edge, folding another edge, folding another edge. Like, that's not what we're talking about. We might be talking about the task of assembly, and a subtask is folding the box. So you don't need to take it to absurd extremes, but hopefully the guidance material there will help you do that. So that's the first element. The second is use of tools or equipment. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, so we probably don't need to spend much time on that. And then the third element over the page is the level of monitoring. And so A talks about constant monitoring, B talks about regular monitoring. We've given some kind of dictionary definitions which hopefully helps. Constant suggests it's all the time. Regular is obviously less than constant. Now, the second part of this page, we talk about what happens when the number of sequential steps conflicts with the level of monitoring or tools. So, for example, you might have someone doing simple tasks with only 1 or 2 sequential steps. So they sound like they're a grade A employee, but then they might not require constant monitoring. So they might be doing very basic work, but they don't need constant monitoring. They only need regular monitoring. That's an inherent conflict in the classification structure. As I said, it's imperfect. My view, at least, is rounding up is not a terrible idea when we're talking about minimum entitlements. So we've called it a good practice guide, and that would be good practice, I think, to round up if in doubt, if they straddle both grades. All right, we'll then move on. Now, okay, so we've looked at the gateway requirements, we've looked at grade A and B. Let's say we're not in that realm, we're in grade 1 to 7. You are effectively classifying an employee like you would in any modern award, in any industry. You look at the classification structure and you select the classification or the grade that is the best fit. Now, it may not be perfect. It's quite often that someone will perform work, or the classification descriptors, parts of one level sound relevant and applicable, but others don't. And then there's some other parts of another grade that sound relevant. It is a bit of a gut feel, kind of best fit, make a judgment call as to where they are. I've had plenty of disputes in the Fair Work Commission over, employees challenging their grade. Commission members tend to kind of give the employee the benefit of the doubt, and if they straddle 2 grades, they kind of round up. So bear that in mind. When we're doing this, we are looking at the work that they actually perform. So my example of a surgeon cleaning windows, just because he has a PhD or she has a PhD does not mean that you pay them at grade 12 of the window cleaning award. You're looking at what they actually do. I'll just call out quickly, grade 1 is effectively a transitional introductory grade, so people shouldn't be on grade 1 permanently. I think, and Paul might correct me afterwards, I think it might have been 6 months, or there might not have been a time limit, and they've now introduced a 3-month window. So just bear that in mind, that grade 1 has changed. After 3 months, the person should progress up to grade 2. So grade 2 is the kind of starting permanent grade. And then we move from 2 to 7. I won't bore you kind of taking you through in granular detail those classification definitions. If we move over the page, Colin, what I'll say a couple of things, and then we can probably open up to questions. The first is the current or the old classification structure in grades 2 to 7 or 2 to 5 are quite detailed, descriptive, and they've got indicative tasks, indicative duties. They talk about different things. They talk about gardening, lawn mowing, they talk about packaging, assembly, they talk about lots of things. The Commission, rightly or wrongly, has determined that that's kind of not helpful, and they've stripped it all out of the classification structure. And instead, what they've put in are some references to other grades in other awards. So, for example, and this applies to grades 2 through to 5, grade 2 has a description, so it talks about a basic task, doing that in accordance with defined procedures under direct supervision. It then effectively has some benchmark or guidance, indicative levels. So it says this may include the performance of work included in the following award classifications. And it has some examples. So it says gardening and landscaping award level 1. So if you get to this part of the exercise, you probably do need to go across to other awards and say, okay, well, what does the gardening level 1 award classification say? Am I in the right realm or am I not? So rather than them being in the body of the support employment award structure, they've just given references. And so you might have to go elsewhere to have a look at it. Bear in mind, the list of the awards is not exhaustive. So just because one of the awards that might be relevant to the work they do, I don't know, general retail or fast food, it's not referenced there, doesn't mean it's not relevant. It's a non-exhaustive list. Now, how do we deal with situations where duties or tasks vary? The Fair Work Commission calls out this principal purpose test, which is generally the one that's applied. You are looking at the principal purpose for which the employee was employed. Now, I don't know how well that fits in the context of supported employment. If someone's working, like doing different things seasonally, the modern award system is not meant to be applied in a way where on Monday someone's mowing lawns, so they're a level X, and on Tuesday they're doing something else, so they're a level Y. You're meant to look at the overall work the person does and the principal purpose for which they're employed, and then grade them into one grade. They're not meant to change grades from day to day or week to week. All right, I'm running out of steam, but thankfully we're near the end. So I'll just mention there are record keeping obligations, and we've got a section on that. And there is also a dispute review type process as well. So bear in mind that employees will have the ability to challenge the grade that you've put them in. And there's effectively a dispute resolution process. So that's the body of the document. We'll then quickly have a look at, Colin, I might need your...
Yep, you take a pause for now. Let's let you have another drink, and you've done bloody well so far. It's an in-depth review. So, Paul, I noticed there are again quite a few questions or chat messages in the chat. Is there anything you'd like to touch on, or that you feel we can touch on today? You're on mute, mate.
Right, pardon me. There certainly is. And Kyle, have you finished your presentation as such?
No, well, so what we might do is let's quickly have a look at, so attachment A is simply a full copy of the new classification structure. So it's there for your reference. Hopefully it's useful. We're not going to go through that. Colin, if you can scroll down, we can get to attachment B. We won't look at that in any detail, but that's the glossary that I referred to at the start of the presentation. So hopefully that's helpful. Let's have a quick look at attachments C and D, just so that people know what we're talking about. Attachment C is the step-by-step guide. So my suggestion is have a look at that. And if you follow that kind of step-by-step process, you should get it right. So you might decide to customize and have your own. But that's what we would suggest is a useful starting point. So for people who are actually out on the factory floor or in the workplace doing the grading process, that's a helpful document for them to have a look at as a starting point. And then attachment D, Colin, if we move to that, if you want a fairly basic form to fill in for each employee to do the grading task, you can use this. You can see there that the idea of the form is you write the employee's name, and then I think there might be prompts for 3 or 4 or 5 different tasks. So we have, for example, task 1, what's the task they do? Is it a simple task? Is it a basic task, or is it a complex task? If it's a simple task, we need to identify the sequential steps involved in that task. We then have prompts for level of supervision. For A and B, we also need to look at level of monitoring. I think it's helpful if we're going to say, well, what are the number of subtasks, to actually identify those subtasks, because if there's some dispute about how you've done it, it's nice to have identified them.
Just a pause there too, Kyle. Paul, yeah. My understanding is we've in that documentation we've formatted that so people can actually utilise and type into that form. Is that still correct?
Yeah, Colin, my understanding is that it's been formatted in such a way that it can have data entered into it. I know we requested that from comms.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
So have a look at attachment D. So in terms of intangible practical terms, the guidance document, I think, is probably essential reading. You should read it. But I think attachments C and D are going to be the helpful documents when you actually undergo the grading exercise. I'll just make a couple of other comments, and then I think we're done and we can open it up to questions. Now, what does all this mean? The slight irony in all of this is there is a deadline of 30 June to grade the employees. So each employee you grade, you obviously should record that somewhere. That's a pretty important thing. There will likely need to be some form of communication to employees as to what's going on, I would have thought. You may or may not write to the employee and tell them how they've been graded. I think obviously you need to tell them they've been graded into whatever they have, because if they don't know how to challenge it, and ask for a review. So that you've got to do it by 30 June. In practical terms, what happens on the 1st of July? Now, if they have not had a supported wage system assessment, so they haven't had a modified SWS assessment, even though you might grade them into grade B on the 30th of June or by the 30th of June, come 1 July, their wage rate will not change, because the way the award changes have been implemented, it's not until they also have the modified SWS assessment that the rubber hits the road, so to speak, and their rate of pay changes. So for some people, for many people, for all employees who don't have a modified SWS assessment, you will grade them by this deadline and then nothing will happen for potentially 2, 3, 6 months. So just bear that in mind. Their rate of pay might not change overnight. Then the second category of people are those who do have a SWS assessment. So they've undergone an assessment, their productivity has been valued at 70% or has been assessed at 70%. Now, what happens for them is by the 30th of June, you've graded them into grade B. On 1 July, they should be getting paid a percentage of grade B. There are some transitional arrangements, so they don't overnight get the 70% of grade B. But because of the no regression, employees' rates of pay cannot go backwards. I think, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I think what will happen is employees who've had an SWS assessment already and are paid in accordance with the SWS tool, so they're not paid under a different tool, many of those employees will be getting paid somewhere between $8 and $12 an hour as of today. There's a distinct possibility that what will happen through this new process is they might be graded into grade B. Effective 1 July, they need to be getting paid a transitional amount of 70% of grade B, but it's less than 70%. And we won't get into the complexities of that. But it'll almost certainly be less than what they're currently on anyway. And then there's a requirement that people's wages cannot be reduced. So we're going to go through this torturous exercise potentially. You'll find out that, under the award, effective 1 July, my legal requirement is to pay them $6.37, but I'm already paying them $11 and I can't reduce it. So that was nice to know. I now know that legally under the award, I pay them $6.37, but I've got to keep paying them $11 anyway. So you do all this and nothing actually changes potentially.
The other one, Kyle, is the fact that some organisations may choose to pay a ceiling and not undergo that supported wage system process at all. So under that grade A, grade B classification, you may choose to just pay at the ceiling, which if you do and they fit, therefore you can make the conscious business decision or commercial decision to not actually undergo the supported wage assessment itself.
That's right. That's right. So I think I'm conscious of time. I might hand over to you guys and we can have a look at some of the questions that have come through and deal with as many of those as we can.
Thanks, Kyle. That was a great run through. I'm sure everyone here today has found that of great benefit. Probably continued my education, being relatively new as well. But thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over to Paul to see, there has again been a bit of a spike. I think we've got about 40 things there in the chat room at least. Just a reminder that NDS's intent is to create a frequently asked questions page on the website alongside of the guide, tools and resources. So we will try and capture that. That isn't live yet. We'll utilise the questions that we get from today and kick that off as soon as we can. But Paul, is there anything there that you'd like to touch on or feel we can actually touch on today?
There certainly is, and I apologise if I'm sounding a bit frazzled. I'm just trying to answer questions copy and paste them and then get a list ready for Kyle to have a look at. Kyle, I've got about 5 or 6 that I've not been able to answer. Are you happy to look at those now?
I'm happy, Paul, but if you haven't been able to answer them, I'll do my best. Let's see how we go.
Thank you for that vote of confidence, Kyle. The first one is from Verena, and it says, theoretically, what would happen if you have if you have supported employees who have been long-term employees and are functional at a level 2 to 3, however, the nature of the tasks you have sit them at an AB level? I understand they would have to be paid at 2 to 3 level. However, is it meaningful for them to complete tasks beneath their capabilities? And sorry, Kyle, just before you go, these are all visible in the chat box, people, if you want to have a look at, if you just want to open that so you can follow it. Kyle, have you got that question there?
Yeah, I do. It's a great question. So don't misinterpret my surgeon window cleaner example. I think we need to be a little bit careful with that example. And so I apologize if it's confused people. Typically, the way we grade or classify employees is we look at the work they actually perform, not the work that they might theoretically be capable of performing. So if a surgeon is cleaning windows, well, they get paid the cleaning window rate, not the surgeon rate, because that's what they're actually doing. But you might recall when we look through those gateway requirements, the 5 gateway requirements, one of them talks about looking at, it says the employee does not have the capacity to perform grade 2 to 7 work or 1 to 7 work. And so I kind of paused there and said, this introduces this notion of hypothetical capability rather than looking at what they actually perform. And so Verena's question calls that out. If they are functional at a level 2 to 3, level of capability, then they would not meet that element of the gateway requirements. So your scenario there, Verena, is that the person is doing potentially A or B work. And so typically you pay them A or B money for the A or B work that they do. But in this case, if they have the capacity to do 1 to 7 work like this person does, then they do not fall into the gateway, or they don't meet the gateway requirements. They can't be classified into A or B, and you would most likely have to classify them at level 2, I would expect. I'll defer on the second part of that question as to whether or not it's meaningful for them to do it. I'll leave that for others. But legally, you would not be able to use A or B, even though they might be doing A or B work, because they have a greater capability.
Okay, thanks for that, Kyle. Now, the next one is from Alison. If an employee can do the tasks at grade 2 but requires constant monitoring, how are they classified?
Good question. So we might go back and have a look at that. The element of the gateway requirements, Colin, if you can scroll up, I just talked about, maybe we'll have a look at that. Just keep going for me. I think it's about a couple of pages higher up. Now, yes, okay, so if we look at the bottom of this page, the second gateway requirement is that the employee must not have the capacity to undertake the duties or exercise the level of skill and responsibility of any position to which grade 1 to 7 applies. So if we consider that, Alison's question is, if an employee can do the tasks at grade 2 but requires constant monitoring, how are they classified? Well, the notion of constant monitoring suggests they're in grade A, but they can do the tasks at grade 2. And so this second gateway requirement won't be met because they do have the capacity to undertake grade 1 to 7 work. So despite the fact they require constant monitoring, I think we're in grade 2 territory for this particular employee, despite the constant monitoring. And bear in mind, there will be internal inconsistencies within the classification structure. You know, like the way it works is we start with simple tasks, constant monitoring, through to more complex tasks with lower levels of monitoring. But of course, people don't necessarily neatly fit those categories. Someone might do complex work but with a lot of monitoring, or very simple work with no monitoring at all. So you're looking for that best fit. So that would be my answer.
Sorry, Paul, I can see a hand up. Chris, have you got something you'd like to share? Sorry, you're on mute at the moment, mate.
Just on that question, I guess the thing about that is the reality is all of us, in most cases, all of our supported employees, to some extent, will always have constant or regular monitoring by virtue of the NDIS funding that we get and the ratios that we've established for each employee. So in that scenario, though, where someone is clearly capable of doing most of the jobs under a grade 2, you know, you've asked them to go and get on the forklift, move some pallets, and they can generally do a whole range of tasks within your ADE, which are commensurate with grade 2. I think really they're really doing it under direct supervision, although we all know they would have some level of constant monitoring, and really it's direct supervision. Ultimately, that's what it gets down to.
I'll chip in with my 2 cents worth too. Thanks, Chris. Is that I think the intent here is aspirational too, and in terms of that rounding up sort of approach, I think the intent is not to find a backward step for people; it's to find an aspirational step forward where possible.
Yeah, and I think Chris's comment as well draws on this, you know, like what's the difference between supervision and monitoring as well, which are very, like they're very similar phrases. There might be a slight dictionary difference between what is supervision or what is monitoring, but they're very, very similar. So it just calls out again the complexity of saying, okay, well, what is direct supervision versus constant monitoring? And there's a couple of paragraphs where we do give you our 2 cents worth, but it's a good point. Paul, I might hand back to you.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. The next one that we've got here is from Kerry. Is an employee using a basic machine, e.g. a bin lifter with an up and down button, for example, is that classed as grade B as it is a machine?
Yeah, we're getting some really good questions. My view, and I said before, we should take a sensible, pragmatic view and interpretation of these. Yes, that's right. That might be a mechanical or electric machine, but it sounds like it's literally a push button. And so I don't necessarily accept that means that they must be graded into grade B. Grade A refers to the use of jigs or equipment or tools with basic functionality. Now, okay, the tool might be mechanical or electrical, but it sounds like it has pretty basic functionality. So I think, again, you're looking at an objective, evaluative judgment. I would not accept that the mere fact that the machine they use is electric means that they can't be in A. I think that would be an overly strict interpretation of grades A and B. And I think we call that out. Colin's helpfully gone to that part of the section. That part of the guidance note that talks about that. I think there's an example, it might be over the page, where there might be situations where people do use a piece of mechanical or electrical equipment, but the equipment might have been modified to make it easier for them to use. Or the equipment might have restricted functionality. So again, you've got to take a pretty sensible, pragmatic approach. My view is if it's the mere fact that it's mechanical or electric doesn't mean they can't be A. I think that would be not a proper interpretation of the structure.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. Now, Simone, if you could just indicate if that answers your question as well, which is where does a scale with a digital readout or a battery-powered pallet mover fall as a tool?
I'll jump in if we don't have Simone. Oh, look, I think
Kyle, she's indicated that it has answered that
Oh,
question.
lovely. Okay.
Moving on now, Shane, how do we approach a situation where a person undertakes complex work, but only with high levels of supervision, i.e. supervision at levels that exceed what would be provided in open employment?
Yeah, again, it's a great example where it calls out the kind of tension in the classification structure, which again is not unique to this classification structure. If someone is doing complex work, then I don't think they can be in A or B, because that's talking about simple tasks. I don't think they're being level 2 or level 1 or 2, because that's talking about basic tasks. So I think in fairness to the employee, they need to be up in the higher echelons of the structure. The fact that they might require a higher level of supervision, I don't think that can negate the fact that they're doing more complex work. Now, this would be a great little test case in the Fair Work Commission to see what a commission member thinks about it. I can tell you there's about 40 commission members. They don't all think exactly the same. And so what one commission member tells you might be different to another one. But I think these types of disputes are resolved to the benefit of the employee rather than the employer most of the time. So I think you would look at the task complexity. I would use that. I would give that greater weight than level of supervision. That would be my view.
Okay, thanks for that, Kyle. Moving on. I think I've answered the next few until we get to David. Example, if we put an employee on grade B, $9.50 per hour, do we then adjust the wage subject to productivity prior to the SWS assessment, as is done in open employment using a supported wage clause, and then adjust again when the SWS assessment is done?
I think the answer is no. I just want to. I'm searching the chat function to try and find David's question, because it was a bit of I feel like it was a triple barrel question. Can you just take me through that, Paul, slightly slower?
Pardon me, Kyle, I'll just try and find the question in the chat box.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. It's a 255. Oh, actually, sorry, David, I think has sent it directly to me. So
okay,
it's not publicly visible.
That's okay. I'll have a crack. So they're grade B, they're $9.50 an hour under the award. I don't quote me on that, but I think that's the substance of the question. So you grade them by 30 June. Come 1 July, the award is in place. There are some there's some phasing in of those hourly rates. So it might not be the $9.50, but if the person has not had an SWS assessment, the rubber does not hit the road. Their rate does not change. So even though you've graded them into grade B, and that's why I said it's slightly ironic that you've got a deadline to do this, but you do it on 30 June, okay, you're now a grade B employee under the award, but until you get an SWS assessment, your rate doesn't change. So you don't need to pay them the $9.50 or even the transitional amount. You need to wait until they get an SWS assessment. Once you've got that, you can apply the percentage of the SWS assessment outcome to the relevant transitional rate of the grade B rate. And so grade B, I think, is phased in over 3 or 4 years, and that's their applicable rate. And so one practical matter here is some employees might be undertaking, like the DSS, the National Panel of Assessors might come to your place of work in July and assess people. Or they might take 3, 6, 9, 12 months to get to your workplace. So until there's an assessment, then under the award, their rate of pay doesn't change. You continue paying them their existing rate until you have that assessment.
Okay, I'm assuming that's hopefully answered David's question. We'll move on. Amanda wants an example of the template populated. I'm just not sure if we could provide that, Amanda. It would simply be an abstract example unless another provider perhaps wanted to provide an example that was de-identified. So we'll certainly investigate that. Wayne has mentioned, should we have a grading committee? I'm assuming he's referring to an internal grading committee. Wayne, is that correct? Again, I can't see why you wouldn't do it. Whether we try and set up some sort of committee, or NDS sets up some sort of committee to look at examples of how employees might be graded. If you could indicate one way or the other, please, if that's what you might mean as well. And we'll just wait for that.
Got a hand up too, Paul, from Roger.
Yep. Roger, if you can unmute yourself and
Not sure if Roger's responding. Would you like to say something there, Roger? Or was it a misplaced hand? No, I think we'll come back to it if need be, Paul.
I don't think he's
Here you
there
go.
anymore. He's
Oh.
not. Oh, pardon me.
I'm back.
He's back.
Couldn't
Go
find
for
you
it,
in the
Roger.
list, Rog. Sorry, Roger, are you there?
I think Roger's gone again.
Okay.
We'll come back to you, Roger. Just either take your hand down if you need to. Otherwise, we'll circle back to you towards the end.
Okay. Now, Pauline's asked a question under ratio-based funding. I understand that the supported employee has to be under direct supervision to meet the requirements of the funding. That is, e.g., 1:5 ratio. The 5 supported employees will be supervised directly for the time they are in employment. If someone is determined as routine supervision, do we have to revisit funding? Again, I don't think that would be an issue. I mean, they're under supervision. I don't think the agency would be checking that. And I'm not sure if, again, that sort of concept would impact on their NDIS plan at all. So I think we can move on there. Kyle, did you have anything to add on that?
So just very quickly, I think there may well be some tension or some potential inconsistency between how the grading rules under the award. And, I know that there's an SWS assessment handbook type document that talks about some things. And there obviously are these other regulatory rules. For the purpose of grading the employee, those documents, those external things are not relevant. We need to look at the classification structure. I'm not going to comment on funding or those types of rules. I would say you don't need to go and look at those things to undertake the grading exercise.
Thanks, Kyle. Okay, so we'll move on. People have asked if there are going to be easy read resources developed for supported employees. I believe they are currently under development, and DSS is leading that work. Now, again, I'll move on at this point. Let's see, where are we up
Hands
to?
up again, Paul. Roger's back with his hand up. So we'll go to Roger. Are you there, Roger?
Yeah, can you hear me this time?
Yeah, yep, got you this
Excellent. So if someone we grade someone into 1 to 7, their wage, like our employees at present are paid at grade 2, a percentage using an approved tool. They remain on that wage until they have an SWS in the grading as well, if they're on grade 1 to 7.
Yeah, so really good question, Rod. I think the answer is yes. So, as I said before, you grade them by 30 June.
Yep.
You don't need to make any adjustment to their rate of pay until such time as they undergo an SWS assessment, because until such time as they undergo that assessment, you don't actually know what you need to pay them under the award.
That's correct, yeah.
And the determination makes that clear. So what that means is, even though these other approved, currently at least approved wage assessment tools are being phased out from 30 June, until such time as they get an SWS assessment, the consequence is you effectively continue paying them their current rate as at 30 June they might be on that rate for 9 months before the national panel of assessors get to your place of work and make
Perfect.
these assessments.
Thank you. Answered. Well done. Thank you. And thank you very much for all the info. Bye.
Sorry, I think Chris, you had your hand up again as well, there, mate.
Yeah, just two questions. Just on the last one about the wage freeze, Carl. If people are on a wage freeze, but we, as you know, in July there'll be a national wage case decision. What's your suggestion as to what we should do in that case? They're on a wage freeze because they're at a level lower, higher than what we think they're going to be assessed. Would you recommend we still increase a percentage in terms of national wage case? I'm just worried about supported employees, for could be several years, not having the SWS, and then for several years not getting a wage increase. That's the first question.
Yep.
If you want to answer that, and I'll ask my second.
Yeah, so I thought that the transitional arrangements with pay dealt with this issue. My recollection is that come 1 July, there'll be a national wage decision. There'll be an increase to the minimum wages, whether that be 3 or 4%. My recollection was that they get the benefit of that, and then you wait for the assessment to occur. Now, okay. I want to just take that on notice, but that was my recollection.
Okay. The second question is, if you've got an employee at grade 2, so they're under direct supervision, but let's say, for argument's sake, and that's where they'll work, 7 hours for the day, but for half an hour, you require them to hop in their car and go and pick up something from down the post office or the shop or whatever and come back. Do I presume the easiest way of dealing with that is that you would simply give them higher duties for that time, because they're really at that point not under direct supervision, they're on routine supervision?
So it's, again, a really good question. As I said a little while ago, the principal purpose test is used by the Fair Work Commission when there's classification disputes, and they say, okay, well, what is the purpose of this person's employment? And that is how we grade them. So it's meant to be, you are a grade 2 employee because the purpose for which you've been employed is to do jobs and duties that are grade 2. It's not intended that their classification changes from day to day or week to week. That's not the intention. But of course, if the person's purpose for their work or their role changes, then of course you reassess it if they change jobs or they do something materially different permanently. And then for those kind of temporary changes, the higher duties clause is the relevant tool. So that will be within the award. Typically speaking, it's if someone's going to act up in a higher role for a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of hours, you can utilize the higher duties. So it doesn't change their classification, but they get the benefit of the higher rate. Now,
but what if it's part of their duties? They're a grade 2, but part of their duties every day is that they will hop in their car and go and pick up the mail and come back.
I mean, what's interesting is the higher duties clause that will come in will say an employee will be paid at a higher grade if carrying out the duties of a higher grade for 2 hours or more.
So that fixes that up. Okay.
So I think you would use that.
Yep.
I mean, my initial reaction was going to be, Chris, because we're talking about best fit, like if 36 hours a week, I'm a grade 4, and then 2 hours a week, I happen to do the run and go and do something that's grade 5. The principal purpose of my role is a grade 4 role.
Yeah. You've just resolved a question that somebody had for me, and the 2 hours fixes that problem up.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Monique, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi. I think this question has been asked. How are we going to manage those on a in a trial phase? So they've got a 13-week minimum trial, but then they might not have a Swiss assessment done for 6, 9, 12 months. So what are the obligations under that? How is that process going to be managed?
So Monique, I'm happy to take it on notice and look at it more closely, but I think for the purpose of today, you simply need to grade them as per the work that they're doing. So what are they doing for that 13-week trial period? Obviously you might not have an intimate knowledge of their capability on day one, but either prior to them starting with you or in the first week or so, you kind of need to make a pretty quick judgment call as to, are they doing grade 4 work or are they doing grade A work? And you should be able to do a pretty quick judgment and get it close.
Yep.
So you grade them. In terms of new employees who come on a trial when they don't have an existing rate as at 30 June, I actually don't know what their I'd want to come back to you in terms of working out how you work out their wage.
Yeah, because it seems a little bit unfair to keep someone who's working at, say, grade 2 level at $2.75 per hour for an extended period of time, and then do we have an obligation to then back pay them for that period of time as well? That has a lot of could cause a lot of issues, I guess, for a business. If their assessed wage then becomes $21 an hour, and we've been paying them $2.75 for 6 months. Where does that sit, I guess? So
I think excellent question. I don't want to lead you down the garden path, so we're going to add that to Paul's list of the FAQs.
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
I think Paul's dropped off there too, and I'd just encourage that if they're doing work at a reasonable level and a reasonable rate, the principle around some of that is to pay them a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. So to strike a reasonable balance in that mix.
Yeah.
Paul, did you want to add to that?
Pay them at the top of the A or B or 2, I guess, for that period.
Yep.
Yeah.
Paul, I'm not sure if you caught that. Did you want to?
Look, sorry, Monique, I didn't. I was actually trying to concentrate on some of the other questions. Would you be able to email me or just put in the chat that question, please, and I'll add it to our list and we can definitely look at it because it does sound like a very interesting question.
Yeah, sure, not a problem.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monique.
Okay, we're just about out of time.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we can cover one more, or is that it? I'll let everyone know I've certainly got this list here. It's a very comprehensive set of questions, and I'll certainly need to be going back to Kyle about some of them. I've noticed some of them basically refer to the SWS, and the questions relate to obtaining SWS assessments, etc. And that's not really part of the scope of today's meeting, but we will certainly answer those questions in time, and that will be in our question and answer resource that will be on our website on our disability employment page, and we'll try and get that up there next week.
Thanks, Paul. Look, in the interest of time, I know we're very close to it now. I'd like to thank Kyle for coming along today and doing a really thorough run, and I appreciate your time for the webinar today. I think that's provided a really comprehensive run through of the guide. And again, just a final disclaimer that it is intended to be a guide and not exhausted. I know I've still left the screen up there with some contact details and purposely including the Fair Work Ombudsman, which I always struggle to say. But again, there will be circumstances where you may wish to reach out, seek other advice and support. But for today, I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance, and none more so than Kyle in terms of your assistance and guide, and the reference group who've assisted in being part of the development of the resource guide as well. Finally, again, keep watch on our NDS webpage. The tools will be there, and the Q&A frequently asked question page will be there as well. And hopefully we've got you some way towards being in a better place for the 30th of June. A lot of work for some of you to do, others not as much, but hopefully you're feeling a little bit more prepared and ready to undertake the work between now and then. Thank you all for your attendance today. Look forward to where it brings us on our little road forward. It's been a long journey so far, and I'm sure there'll be more to come in due course. But thanks for your attendance today, guys. Now, Paul, I'm not sure if you managed to find a little poll or not at the end. Pop it up now before everyone starts jumping away, which I think everyone will be if we have it or don't have it. Hang on, I do have it.
Sorry, Colin.
I can launch it. There we
Oh,
go.
fabulous. No, that's what I was worried about, that it was that question.
Did it pop up?
It did.
Thank you.
And thanks,
guys,
everyone. Please answer that if you haven't already.
Please, I'll leave it live because normally hits time and everyone exits.
Yep, and thanks everyone again for attending today and those fantastic questions.
Sure. The other thing I probably should say too is I know there's various state managers around the NDS team too that'll be happy to discuss with you, point you in the right direction. So keep up the dialogue with your state managers as well. That's guys, I think we've caught just about everyone that was remaining within the poll from what I can see, which is fantastic. And by all indicative measures, that seems to be a really positive one. So great work, Kyle. You've starred today.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thanks
folks.
very much, guys.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing.